Democracy Net on West Africa Democracy Radio 94.9 FM, Dakar.
Citizens Hour on West Africa Democracy Radio. It's your time to speak.
Hello and welcome to Citizens Hour on West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting on 94.9 FM, and this version of Citizens Hour is supported by the National Endowment for Democracy Net. I am Veronique Njai. Across the Sahel, military takeovers, insecurity, political transitions, and growing public frustration with democratic institutions have triggered one of the biggest governance debates on the African continent. Countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have experienced dramatic political changes, including military-led transitions, the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, and the withdrawal from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. Supporters of these changes argue that traditional democratic systems have failed to deliver stability and development, including security in these regions. Others warn that the region may be experiencing democratic decline. So today we ask, is the Sahel experiencing the end of democracy or the rebirth of a new governance system? To unpack this, I am joined by three distinguished guests: Professor Stefano, a comparative politics expert and professor at the University of Pavia in Italy. Good afternoon, Mr. Stefano, or Professor Stefano.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Thank you for having me here.
Okay, thank you for joining us. Please, throughout the conversation, we would kindly appreciate if the camera is on, just so we get to see you as the conversation unfolds. Thank you so much. I am also joined by Marie Josiane Ga, project coordinator of WADR, that is the West Africa Democracy Solidarity Network. Good morning.
Good morning, Veronique. Nice to have you and with all the other panelists.
Thank you. So we are also expecting Boniface Dolani, Director of Surveys at Afrobarometer and an Associate Professor at the University of Political Science and Government at the University of Malawi. Welcome to all our guests. So to begin, military leaders in parts of the Sahel have increasingly defended their actions as necessary corrections to the failing political systems in the region. One of the strongest and most debated narratives has come from Burkina Faso's transitional leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who has publicly argued that democracy in its current form is not suitable for African realities. Take a listen to this excerpt.
Il faut que les gens oublient la question de démocratie.
People need to forget about democracy, and that in itself is a challenge. Let's speak the truth. Democracy is not for us. The kind of democracy being presented to us is not something we are interested in. We don't even want it. Normally, if someone comes to talk to an African about democracy in that way, you should walk away. Democracy kills. Is that what we want? Democracy is slavery. There is no real democracy in this world. They apply it when it suits them, and to impose it, they kill. That kind of democracy, we don't want it. May God protect us from it. We are focused on our reconquest, our rebuilding, and our revolution.
Sur notre refondation et sur la révolution.
That was Burkina Faso's transitional leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Marie, I'll begin with you. When leaders openly question liberal democracy in this way, what does this tell us about the current political mood across parts of the Sahel?
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I think it's a very important and sensitive issue that Captain Ibrahim Traore has raised. And I think this kind of speech needs to be approached, with nuance. So when leaders like Ibrahim Traore questions democracy, then I think we need to ask, what exactly are they rejecting? Because in reality, many citizens, not only in the Sahel, in Africa, I don't think citizens, they reject the idea of democracy itself, but they are questioning how that democracy is practiced and how that democracy, provide the benefits for the citizens. So let me explain. First, in those countries, we have had elections, we have had constitutions, we have had civilian governments for years. So formally, democratic systems were in place. But, for many citizens, democracy became associated with insecurity, corruption, elite capture, and a sense that governments were disconnected from everyday reality. So in Burkina Faso, similarly in Burkina Faso, after the 2014 popular uprising that removed long-time rule Blaise Compaoré, there was a strong hope for democracy. But, insecurity worsened and large part of the country, became inaccessible. Many citizens began to question whether democratic governments were able to ensure basic security. So when leaders like Ibrahim Traore say democracy is not suitable, it's not for us, I think it resonates with some frustration. But I'll qualify it as a political narrative, and this is where we need to be careful, because questioning democracy can only serve two purposes. So on the one hand, it can reflect real citizens' frustration with governance. And on the other hand, it can also be used to justify, concentration of power and limited accountability. So at the core of democracy, as we all know, there is accountability, participation, representations, and the ability of citizens to influence decisions that affect their lives. So those are not foreign values, right? They exist even in many African governance traditions, including community-based decision-making and consultation. So the real issue, I don't think, is whether democracy is suitable for Africa, but what kind of democracy we are building, because today citizens demand more effective governance, more dignity, more inclusion. They want systems that work for them. So, the failure of democratic government should not automatically lead to the rejection of democratic principle. And military regime also faced serious challenges. Ibrahim Traore's regime also faced serious challenges. There is limited accountability, there is restrictions on civic space, long-term sustainability questions. So I think the real challenge for the Sahel, and if we want to talk about Africa more broadly, is to rebuild a democratic system that are more responsive, more inclusive, and more rooted in citizens' reality. So for me, I think the question is not whether Africa wants, democracy, or if the Sahel wants democracy, but the real question is what form of governance can truly deliver that legitimacy, that security, and that dignity to the people of Burkina Faso, the people of Sahel, and in the whole of Africa.
All right. I did appreciate that you asked the question, what are we rejecting, and that citizens do not reject democracy, because we will also be hearing from some citizens in the Sahel regarding what they make of democracy in the Sahel region. But before that, let's hear from Professor Stefano. Professor Stefano, how should we interpret this kind of rhetoric from political leaders from a comparative point of view?
Thank you. I basically agree with what I heard from the guest that spoke before me. But I also heard in this declaration something which is a bit surprising to me, because I think Traoré could easily have been said what we just heard. He could have said, we are not criticizing democracy, but the way democracy has been presented to us, the way it has been working. Why he didn't say so? What he said actually is that they are not interested in democracy. I'm not saying that what we heard so far is correct. I think there are serious issues behind this situation, serious frustration, structural problems. But I think there is also something a bit more ambitious in what we have heard in the words of Traoré. I think there is clearly an idea of something else beyond democracy. He talked about revolution at the end of his speech. So he's clearly, in my view, figuring out a system which is not necessarily a better democracy or a good democracy, but is talking about something that could be actually a different system. And maybe this different system can be much better for democracy, who knows that? But he's not simply, let's say, focusing on the problem with real democracy as it has been presented, as it has been working thus far, but is also, in my view, giving it to a speech a kind of ideological connotation that goes beyond the notion of democracy itself and presents aspects that do not simply point to a temporary suspension of democracy, but to a plan to build something different than democracy itself. This is how I interpret these words.
All right. I know you did mention about structural issues and the fact that they're probably searching for a better system. However, our team gathered reactions from citizens in Niger and Mali, which are part of the Sahel countries that we're talking about, regarding democracy, governance, and the political direction of the region at the moment. However, many people approached were reluctant to openly speak or comment on the issue because of the sensitivity surrounding political discussions in that region. In Burkina Faso, where we have Traoré and where most of the conversation we're having right now is centered on, all the individuals that were approached to speak on the topic declined to comment entirely, describing discussions around the country's political situation as highly sensitive. Those reactions perhaps already say something about the current political climate in that region. In Niger, however, citizens were asked whether they believe they are currently living in a democracy and why. Take a listen.
Depuis les événements du 26 juillet, on n'est plus en démocratie, dans la mesure où...
Since the events of July 26, we are no longer in a democracy, in the sense that we no longer feel that legality, that conformity with the Constitution. We are under a regime of coup plotters who are already forcing us to merely observe events whether we like them or not. We are merely observing. I really don't feel free, because today I wonder whether I have freedom of expression, to the extent that I even wonder whether what I am about to say won't harm my reputation. I am already forced to weigh my words, and yet, in this regard, I would simply say that we are not under the rule of law, which means we are not under a democratic regime. Today, the citizens of Niger are merely observers.
Les citoyens nigériens sont seulement des observateurs.
On se sent en démocratie.
We feel we live in a democracy because when we talk about democracy, we're talking about fundamental freedoms. And fundamental freedom belongs to the people. The people are the only ones who decide who will govern and who cannot govern. And the people support the current regime. In other words, it is government of the people by the people. And the people in Niger today support the government. Even though life is difficult, we know that this is a sacrifice we have made. Even though, at the moment, we can't say that things are going well financially, but when it comes to freedom, we are free. We think what we want, and that's what we want, and the current government stands with the people.
Et le gouvernement actuel il est avec le peuple.
Il nous faudrait faire une prise de conscience.
We need to raise our awareness so that we can truly take control of our environment, our society, and our country. There are some flaws with our democracy. It's true. There are some flaws in their approach. But those flaws don't mean we should give up. It's true. There is famine. We are hungry. Everything is expensive in Niger. But we will deal with these shortcomings. It's up to us to close these gaps. But how? By supporting this movement.
C'est de soutenir ce mouvement.
La démocratie en tant que telle, vraiment.
Democracy as such, we are not experiencing it at the moment. We are not experiencing it. There are a lot of things that are missing at the moment. We could mention freedom of expression and several other things, really. We are not free to express ourselves, to say what we want. If we dare to make certain comments, we already know what awaits us. That's kind of it.
C'est un peu ça.
It's clear that opinion is divided in Niger. While from the Vox Pop, someone believes that they are currently in a democracy. Three of the people argue that it is not really a democracy. Mari Jazenga, how would you, or what would be your reaction to the comments that were made by Nigerians about the current situation in their country?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think from what I've heard, as like you said, they are divided. Opinions are divided. But on one hand, I heard those who believe that democracy is still important, even though it has challenges, and that the current political order will help to restore, I will call it maybe the social and economical order in terms of security, in terms of jobs. And then there are others who also believe that democracy should just be rejected. It doesn't work. So I think it's very important to take into consideration those different perspectives. And my reaction to that is to acknowledge that, you know, in the Sahel being a very sensitive region, exposed to a high level of insecurity, I think democracy in the Sahel could and should have been practiced differently than what it was practiced before the authoritarian regime came. But I think we must be clear about one thing. For me, is that citizens are definitely not rejecting democracy as an ideal. So what many are questioning is how democracy has been implemented and experienced. So, you know, for many citizens, democracy became too focused on elections, too dominated by elites, and too disconnected from everyday's reality. So I think in the Sahel, in the case of the Sahel, democracy should have been done differently, to focus more on inclusion, to focus more on accountability, and really more on responsiveness to citizens' needs. So I think that if there is something to be done, or if there are some kind of reforms to be engaged, it should be on those areas, right? And it takes me to another question that, you know, I perceive from the citizens talking is whether, you know, military rule can really help to restore that kind of social and economic order. And I think that's also where opinions are indeed divided. You know, the support for the military regimes is because citizens, they hope for a stronger leadership. They hope for an improved security, and also they have a sense of national sovereignty, and we have to take that sentiment seriously because it reflects real frustration and urgency, right? But of course, there are also important concerns because military regimes often concentrate power, and as we can see in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, there is limited civic space, you know, delayed transition. At this moment, we don't even know when the next elections are scheduled. I think in Burkina Faso, it's clear that it is not even on the agenda of the military regime. So those systems operate with less accountability. right? So the question for me remains, can they sustain it in the long term?
All right.
And this is why, yeah.
All right, Professor Stefano, from a comparative perspective again, should we interpret the current developments in regions like the Sahel as a genuine decline of democracy?
Well, this is very difficult because it is actually not a phenomenon that we can observe just in one region. I think in many regions of the world we have a similar situation. And we have a similar situation in the West as well. I would like, although the economic and political history are very different, we are in a situation of big dissatisfaction with democracy in the West as well, or with democracy or with the kind of governance we have been experiencing in recent years. So this feeling is not something peculiar to the region in a comparative perspective. I think that there is something you can observe in many other places. So when we have to make an assessment about whether this is a genuine decline of democracy or not, it becomes a very, let's say, very complex problem, because it's not something that we can, let's say, limit to just one region, but it's something that affects many countries in the world. And I think the general ideological consensus for the model of democracy that is not right now having the same, let's say, consensus and legitimacy that it had until 20 years ago. There are many critics in many places on the world about the performance of democracy, first of all, if not about its principles. So I think that something is going on. Something is going on. We cannot just think that this reflect temporary problems or temporary issues or local regional issues. I think that something is going on in many places in the world that points to the existence of some fundamental structural problem, either with democracy or with the way the governance of our political system have been, let's say, working thus far. So I think that all these protests basically refer to something true going on.
But what are the key indicators that democracy is actually nearly collapsing or has collapsed or is breaking down, and or is just merely facing temporary issues?
Well, time, first of all. You say temporary issues or temporary stress. That's something that we can measure with time. And I think some of the countries that have been experiencing a suspension of democracy are not actually just waiting for something new, but they can be in a more stable situation that is going to take a lot of years. So this is an indicator, first of all, that there is a change, which is not just a temporary change, but something that, let's say, show that the building of something different can be going on. Other indicators obviously refer to many important social or economic aspects, but I think, first of all, what you should focus on is the balance of forces, the balance of power within every country. Sometimes there are concentration of power because of political actions or because of economic consequences of governmental policies that create concentration of power that in the long run are, let's say, not easily compatible with democracy.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Stefano. I am aware that we are now joined by Boniface Delany, Director of Surveys at Afrobarometer and an Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and Government at the University of Malawi. Good afternoon or good morning, Mr. Delany.
Good afternoon.
Okay, great to have you join us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Okay, so the conversation is still on. We just listened to the voices of citizens in Niger regarding what they make of democracy in their country. Meanwhile, in Mali, citizens were asked a broader question, and the question is democracy still the best form of governance? Here are some of their reactions.
Le meilleur système demeure la démocratie et jusqu'à preuve du contraire.
Democracy remains the best system until proven otherwise. In this social contract, Jean-Jacques Rousseau stated that if there were a people of God, it would govern itself democratically. So this means that until proven otherwise, we may not see a system as perfect as democracy. And it's not just about elections. Democracy is about transparency. Democracy is accountability. So there is a set of principles in place. Democracy is individual liberty. Democracy is a rule of law. Democracy is a separation of powers. Therefore, democracy is opposite of arbitrariness. The march towards democracy is inevitable. Democracy is for the well-being of the people.
Est inévitable. La démocratie, c'est pour le bien-être des populations.
Moi, je pense que le système de gouvernance.
I think the system of governance that is best for all of us is democracy, because this system allows everyone to express themselves. It gives everyone the opportunity to find their place in society, whether economically, socially, culturally, or otherwise. So we need democracy, because the law of the strongest has never benefited a people in the long term. It also ends in chaos, which is not what we want. So we need democracy so that everyone can express themselves in equality and with mutual acceptance.
L'égalité et l'acceptation de tous.
Pour la démocratie, il faudrait quand même adapter, c'est-à-dire ce système de gouvernance.
Democracy, however, requires that this system of governance be adapted to the reality of the country, to the reality of the movement, and to the reality on the ground. Because democracy is a system of governance that is practiced in many African countries, but we must not forget that it is the root cause of much of the unrest in those African countries. Democracy certainly entails freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and a multi-party system. But we must acknowledge that democracy is at the root of many conflicts, because it is within democracy that we have seen poorly organized elections, rigged resorts, and leaders who amend the constitution to stay in power. European countries that are truly democratic have each tried to adapt democracy to the reality of their own country. So regardless of the system of governance, in my view, it must still be adopted to the reality of the country in question.
Le système de gouvernance, pour moi, il faut quand même adapter à la réalité du pays en question.
All right, those were the voices of Malians regarding what they make of democracy in their country. Mr. Boniface, or Professor Boniface, I'll start with you. What is your reaction to the voices of Malians regarding what they make of democracy? And from Afrobarometer's point of view, do you have any studies or findings that suggest that citizens are becoming more open to alternative governance systems if democracy fails to deliver?
Yeah, thank you. I can relate, I think, to what is being said. It did remind me of the words of the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill when he said democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms of government that have been tried from time to time. I think, clearly from the sentiments of the citizens of Mali, democracy is not perfect, but that the alternatives are much, much worse than the imperfections of a poorly performing democracy. From our surveys, we do see that over time, this proportion of African citizens that have been saying they support democracy has been declining over time. In our most recent surveys, we only found that about just 2/3 of African citizens still express preference for democracy over alternatives. I mean, two-thirds is still quite a strong support, and I think Africans, when we compare to other global regions, still profess, I think, support and preference for democracy compared to alternatives. I think from the citizens, I think from Mali, what is clear is that democracy is failing to deliver on its promises. It's not democracy itself, and I think the danger is to conflate the challenges that are there with democracy. When one has poorly performing democratic leaders, one should not then rush to blame democracy as a system. Of course, we do see in an increasing proportion of African citizens, I think, warming up to military rule, for example. And when you look at Mali, Burkina Faso, even in Niger, we see just very, very small proportions of citizens in those countries expressing rejection of military rule when we compare to maybe about a decade ago. But again, I think this is just the frustration with democratic leaders, as one of the people mentioned. They are leaders who manipulate constitutions to cling on to power, leaders who are corrupt and are basically seen as failing their own peoples. But the problem in that case is the supply side of democracy, not on the demand side of democracy, if I could put it that way.
Professor Stefano, what tends to happen when democratic systems are perceived as ineffective during prolonged crisis, like in the case of the Sahel?
Democracies are like every other political system, so they have to deliver on their premises, as my colleague said. And so if they do not, if they go into long period of, let's say, inefficiency, they start obviously to lack not only people support, but also, I mean, intellectual prestige and credibility. You have to believe into a system. You have to think, one of the voices that we heard mentioned Rousseau. So you have to believe in those ideas. You have to believe that those ideas are a good guide, a good principle to the way you want to live in your community. And if reality does not, match up with the expectations, obviously you can have many form of let's say questioning of the not only of what you see but the principles themselves. I think that what people have in mind when they talk about democracy can be very different, actually. But the higher expectation that usually they have in democracy make also of this regime one that is more fragile than others. So what happens when they are not up to the task is something that maybe is more peculiar to democracy than other regimes that have more instruments to maintain stability than democracy itself. In general, I think every regime suffers from these conditions, but democracy may suffer a bit more than others.
All right. Marie Josianga, what are the biggest factors driving public frustration with democratic governance in the Sahel today?
Okay. I think it is clear that in the Sahel today, as we have mentioned earlier, Sahel is a region with high level of insecurity. And I think for me, that's one of the key factors in the Sahel, insecurity and lack of protection, because in many parts of the Sahel, villages are attacked, markets are disrupted. So citizens will ask a very basic question: if the state cannot protect us, then what is the purpose of democracy, right? And then, so that's the first one for me, I think, the insecurity question. But then you also have, like was mentioned by my colleague, the service delivery, the weak service delivery. The democracy is not able to really deliver on its promises because citizens struggle with unemployment, lack of basic services like education and healthcare, and that creates frustration, especially among the youth that form the majority of the population. You also have issues around corruption, elite disconnection, it's a system where democracy is associated not with representation, but rather with privilege and inequality. And most importantly also is the loss of trust. So that's also a key factor of public dissatisfaction. So the loss of trust and I would say the legitimacy, the democratic legitimacy, because if citizens begin to feel that their voice do not matter, elections will not change outcome, leaders are not responsive, then we can call it a crisis of legitimacy.
But
I think
but who should we blame?
Yeah.
But who should we blame for the mistrust, as you mentioned? Should we blame the leaders, or who should we keep accountable for this situation?
Yeah, I think it's we should be careful with the idea of the blame, because what is happening in the Sahel is not the result of just one actor, right? It's the result of multiple failures over time. So if we want to simply blame one group, then we risk missing the real problem, right? So we can talk about national political leadership. That's clear. That of course there has been failure to build trust, to build that trust and to deliver the results. But we can also think about the regional actors, maybe, and I'm thinking of institutions like ECOWAS, right? Because some citizens feel that they have been inconsistent. The focus has been placed on reacting to coups than preventing governance crisis. And then you also have international partner that affect how citizens perceive both government and international involvement, and of course you also have structural and historical factors, colonial legacy, and all those things. So I think for me, the priority is not to assign the blame, but to focus on rebuilding that trust between citizens and institution, and creating that governance system that can genuinely respond to people's needs.
All right, Delani, Murray mentioned ECOWAS, and obviously we have seen that these Sahel countries have left the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, to have or form the AES. Based on your research or surveys, what is citizens' reactions or citizens' sentiments regarding ECOWAS, especially the exit of these countries from the regional body?
Thank you. I mean, we are yet, I think, to survey in these countries to see what their sentiments are about the decision, I think, to leave ECOWAS. But just to say again that, yes, it's supportive for ECOWAS, not just in the 3 Sahel countries that have since left, has been declining over time. But again, I think this just again reflects the frustrations that I think, as my colleague put it, people have, that ECOWAS is just one of the institutions that doesn't seem to step in and help them in their times of need. ECOWAS, and indeed most of our regional blocs, are considered really just like clubs of dictators, that they are there to defend one another, to defend the leadership in the different countries, rather than advancing the interests of the ordinary man and woman on the streets. Indeed, you see these frustrations with the unemployment and failure to create new jobs, failure even for ECOWAS and the other regional bodies to speak out when elections are being manipulated, to the extent that a lot of people, although they express a preference for elections as the best way of choosing elected leaders, but they also, frustrations that elections are failing to deliver the kind of leaders that can advance the interests of ordinary citizens on the continent, and that bodies like ECOWAS are really failing to challenge governments, to challenge political leaders and political parties who seek to manipulate elections. And indeed, as it's also been pointed out, that again, bodies like ECOWAS, it's not standing up against the, foreign interference. I mean, when countries are come under attack as they have, ECOWAS has just proven it to be just as, I was going to say as just as incompetent really in helping out these governments to fight, to fight the insurgencies in their countries, so much that it's seen as increasingly irrelevant and remote to advance the interests of ordinary citizens in these countries.
Obviously, there have been a lot of frustration regarding how some situations have been managed by ECOWAS, especially regarding the fact that some of the leaders have been able to manipulate their constitutions to prolong their terms in office and all of these issues. Marie Josenga, looking at some of the things that Delani has mentioned regarding ECOWAS and some of the shortcomings of the institutions, what do you think is ECOWAS' responsibility now when it comes to the current trajectory of governance in not just the Sahel but in West Africa?
Okay, as far as ECOWAS is concerned, I think one main responsibility is to understand that its role goes beyond reacting to coups. And political and preventive responsibility in safeguarding democracy and stability in West Africa, right? So normally, ECOWAS is supposed to defend constitutional order, and like they did in the Gambia in 2016, 2017, when former President Yahya Jammeh refused to step down after losing elections. But responding to recent coups, that's a more difficult realities, because ECOWAS has faced more complex situations in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. So the key challenge for ECOWAS is its legal authority. And, politically, it has been weakened. So I think there is a gap between reacting and preventing. So many citizens ask, why do ECOWAS react strongly to coups, but less strongly to governance failures to lead those coups? And even though ECOWAS has been quite effective at defending constitutional order after crisis, but it's true that it has been less effective at addressing the governance issues that create those crises. So I think today ECOWAS faces a huge perception problem, right? So I think ECOWAS should also try to do things differently, being more consistent, engage more with citizens, civil society, focus not only on elections, because we can see a lot of, communiques always after pre-election, post-elections, but I think ECOWAS should focus not only on election, but also on accountability and service delivery, and rebuild that trust in regional governance. So yeah, if ECOWAS wants to remain relevant, I think it must move from just being a guardian of the rules to become a real partner of rebuilding legitimacy and trust across the region.
Okay, Professor Stefano, we have seen these countries, by these countries I mean Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso, leave the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, to form the AES, which is the Alliance of Sahel States. Do you feel this shifts the regional democratic alignment in these countries, and what impact would that have regionally when it comes to the conversation of democracy in the region?
I think that we can understand the meaning and relevance of these international decisions only if we put them into a larger context. I don't want to escape from the region and its own specific problems, but everybody can see from outside that these regional alliances and breakups of regional alliances and creation of new initiatives are also aligned with an international system in which there are other actors that are making their policy and trying to establish relationship with the actors in the region. I think everybody can see that this creation of this new alliance, as you mentioned in Sahel, has been supported by Russia, for example, and has resorted to the support of Russian military, for example, to ensure security in their country. And this clearly is not something which is making European or Western countries happy. So in the way they react to the situation in the region, they are strongly affected by these geopolitical considerations. I think we cannot talk about democracy in isolation from these problems. Democracy is into this context, something that can take place into this context, and it's not, let's say, something that happen independently of the international context. We need international conditions that make possible the stability of countries, relatively high level of independence from external pressure, because without that you cannot have a functioning democracy.
Professor Stefano, you mentioned international conditions, and when we saw the coups in these countries, we saw that ECOWAS tried to impose sanctions and diplomatic pressure on these countries. Would you say that tools like diplomatic pressure or sanctions often produce the results that are required or desired in such cases?
There is a long discussion about the ability of sanction to produce positive outcomes, and diplomatic pressure as well. But recently, I think the most important, let's say, debate has been about the role of sanctions, because we have seen actually there is a large consensus about the inability of sanction to deliver to the at least to what are the official goals, the declared goals for taking sanctions. You can have also undeclared goals that sanctions are pursuing, but in general we see that they are not very efficient instruments, and for many reasons. But actually you can say about sanctions what, my colleague reminded us about Winston Churchill, that used to say about democracy: sanctions maybe are the only instrument you have before open conflict. So maybe you resort to sanction because the alternative would be even worse. And the large use of sanction that we have seen in the world in the last 20 years has basically also discredited these instruments in the eyes of many people that are looking on how the impact of sanctions is not really affecting political leaders or political structure, but is an instrument that is not smart, as they usually said. Many people talk about smart sanction. They are actually not smart at all in their impact. So this instrument is really criticized. And I think even in this case, West Africa is not an exception to what we see in many other regions in the world.
Okay, thank you, Professor Stefano. Professor Boniface, what is your position regarding the imposition of sanctions when it comes to solving situations like this or ensuring democracy in these countries? Sorry, you're muted. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So look, I think the way sanctions would work is because the sanctions usually, the main complaint about sanctions is that they tend to hit ordinary citizens more than the political leaders themselves. So, they could have what I would describe as a backfire effect, that if the sanctions are hitting ordinary citizens, rather than expecting those citizens to rally against, I think, these new and democratic leaders, what might happen is that it would actually force people to go and decide more with the very same leaders that you are trying to remove. So that's, I think, really what has happened in this particular case. And I think when ECOWAS tried to intervene and impose sanctions. We saw, I think, a lot of protests in Niamey, for example, of ordinary citizens rising up and, protesting against ECOWAS. So I think that's the kind of backfire effect. But, sanctions would only work if eventually they make ordinary citizens side with those imposing the sanctions. Of course, I think as my colleagues have pointed out about these unconstitutional efforts to remove term limits, for example, in countries where such attempts have been pushed back, thinking of Malawi, Zambia, among others, we've seen, I think, a strong civil society action as well, supporting, I think, the efforts and the campaigns against removing a term limit. So you need sanctions, if in this particular case, to be embraced by ordinary citizens. But these are people that are already hating, and to expect them to look at sanctions as a tool for putting pressure on their leaders, I think it's quite a tall ask, if you ask me.
Thank you. Mari, how concerned should the region be about the growing popularity of military leaders among sections of the population?
Sorry, can you come again?
I was asking, because we've spoken about sanctions and the fact that obviously when it comes to the case of the Sahel, sanctions have not been working. And Delani also mentioned the fact that the sanctions should be able to ensure that the citizens side with the people imposing the sanctions. But in the case of the Sahel, that's not what we are seeing or experiencing. So how concerned should the region be about the growing popularity of the military leaders among sections of the population, like Delani mentioned?
Okay. For me, the growing popularity of military leadership raise is a very important signal, and it raises serious concern about not only politics but the future of governance and stability, because we need to understand why this popularity exists. And as we said earlier, we have identified those key drivers, the factors, the insecurity, the economic hardship. So some citizens see the military regime as potential solution. So the popularity of military regime reflect those real frustration and unmet expectations. But however, I can let's say raise some major concern, and for me, I think there is a risk of normalizing unconstitutional power. Because if military takeovers begin to seen as acceptable or desirable, it weakens a very fundamental democratic principle that political power should come from citizens through constitutional process. So and then if coup become normalized, then it creates that uncertainty and a cycle where power can change through force rather than institutions. Then I'm also concerned about the weak accountability, which is essential in democracy. But in that instance, there will be weak accountability and concentration of power, where decisions are made without sufficient checks and balance. And, there's also that uncertainty or that long-term solution uncertainty. The sustainability. What the military government may promise, are we sure that they will really deliver? Because as we see now, like it's the case in Burkina Faso, the military regime, they came with the promise to reduce the insecurity, the terrorism, the same in Mali, but we are seeing what is happening, and the issue becomes real, more and more every day. So can they deliver and sustain this outcome, right? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we spoke about the crisis of legitimacy, because the popularity of military regime should not be understood as a rejection of democracy itself. It's better understood as a crisis of trust, in existing political systems. So I think the growing popularity of military leadership is less about support for authoritarianism, but more about that dissatisfaction. And if this trend continues, we risk weakening democratic norms, accountability, and creating uncertainty about the future, the political order in the region.
All right. Thank you very much, Marie Jazane. Now, I think we will close the first part of the conversation, which is, are we witnessing an end of democracy in the Sahel? I'll just take maybe one minute from all of you to first comment on that. I'll start with you, Professor Boniface. Would you say we are witnessing an end of democracy in the Sahel?
I think it is very premature to say we're seeing an end to democracy in the Sahel region. I think what we're seeing are frustrations with the democracies that are imperfect and perhaps a leadership that is failing to deliver. And as I said at the beginning, I think we need to make that distinction. Support for democracy remains very strong, not only in the Sahel region, but across the African continent. But what I think we are seeing is increased dissatisfaction with the performance of democracy. And I think it's this dissatisfaction that sometimes leads people to start to think that maybe we should explore alternatives. Just listening to the previous speaker, it's also a threat not only to the Sahel region. I think this rise and the increasing popularity of military governments. I think there has been quite a lot of, propaganda on social media, propagating, I think, how great the governments, especially in Burkina Faso, is, to the extent that there are a lot of people on the continent that are now beginning to look at Burkina Faso as a model, not only for democracy, but as a model for governance, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of what is being propagated on the social media is actually false. But I think democracy still enjoys support, but I think what needs to be done is to address, I think, the supply side to make sure it delivers for the benefit of ordinary people.
All right, thank you. Professor Stefano, I'd ask you, would you also say, or would you agree with him that it's not the end of democracy? What is your thought? Would you say there's an end of democracy in the Sahel?
Unfortunately, I must say that I'm a bit more pessimistic, but not just for the Sahel. I think if we make an historical comparison, the situation of the world 30 years ago and the situation of the world as it is now, and this problem of the spread and consolidation of democracy in the world 30 years ago and now, we see that the conditions are changing. And in my view, they are not changing in a way that make the future prospects for democracy better. I think we have the possibility that we will look at this moment, the moment we are living now, as one of, let's say, a lost opportunity. Because 30 years ago, we had much better condition for the implementation of democracy, and unfortunately, as we have seen, as we have said today many times, the expectations have not been met in many countries. The international conditions are changing. They are not leading always to the same conclusion. I think there is a big reshape in world order going on, so regions can come up with better conditions and better opportunities that they had before. But in general, we are also going towards the period at the international level which is more conflictual. And this, I think, is one of the conditions that can make the future of democracy a bit more, difficult.
So are you saying we should explore alternatives?
No, I'm making predictions. I'm not suggesting to explore alternatives. I'm saying that there is a possibility that, as a matter of fact, democracy will live in harder times, which doesn't mean that democracy is no longer a good system or a set of principles that everybody should prefer. But I think alternatives will emerge, either we like it or not. That is my point.
Okay, alternatives will emerge. Marie Josenga, what is your position regarding this? Is the Sahel witnessing an end of democracy or an end to democracy?
Yeah, for me, I think I joined the view that it's not the end of democracy, even though I believe that we are witnessing a time of change, and as my predecessor said, there should certainly be some alternative or some new ways of doing things, because this recent crisis just bring the issue of rethinking how democracy can work better. And I think because as far as Africa is concerned, especially in African countries after the years 90s, when democracy started in Africa, liberalism and political parties. I think there has always been democracy, just that democracy is not just something that's, a size-fitting, concept. It has to be adapted to some reality. And I think that what we are witnessing now is a change, a shift in democracy legitimacy. So it's not about democracy, is it ending? No, I'm not sure it's ending, but its legitimacy is being challenged, it's being questioned, and maybe it will open the door, it will pave the way for new ways of thinking, new ways of practice, how to implement democracy with looking at the global order, how things evolve, how coordinated and transnational issues are becoming. So I think it's a real opportunity to rethink, to redesign, reimagine democracy, not only in West Africa, but in general in the world.
Marie Josenga, you did say that democracy or the legitimacy of democracy is being challenged, and you also did say that it is time for change and we should possibly explore alternatives. Professor Stefano did also say that alternatives will arise, while Professor Boniface said maybe we should explore alternatives. But what are these alternatives? What should an alternative look like? And what alternative would reflect the African reality or would reflect the local realities of the Africans? How should an alternative to Western or liberal democracy look like? Marie Josenga, I'll have you first.
Yeah, so already there is not a perfect alternative to democracy that will automatically solve governance. What we are seeing today is not necessarily the replacement of democracy by a completely new system, but rather, the emergence of different form of governance, right? So in countries like the Sahel countries, we see that military regimes, they position themselves as alternative because they emphasize that, right here, right now, we need strong authority, we need security first approaches, and we need more national sovereignties, and they will put issues around human rights aside, right? But that's still will bring some challenges. And another model maybe is more centralized civilian system where power is concentrated in strong leadership. But we also have what maybe we are increasingly seeing, which is not maybe pure alternative, but kind of hybrid governance systems that combine military influence, control political participation, and strong nationalist narrative. And that's likely the direction that some Sahelian countries are moving towards.
But where would that leave the citizens?
So that is why I brought the concept of hybrid system, right? Because at the end of the day, we still need to have the citizens at the center. Whichever alternative will those issues or those reality brings to the table, there should always be the citizens at the center. So I think the real problem is not finding that alternative to democracy, because what we said is that seeing the way things are moving, things are being shaped, then certainly alternative will emerge, but those alternatives will have to improve governance system to deliver security, to deliver accountability, and to restore the dignity of the citizens. So it's not that we are abandoning democracy, because at the core of democracy are the citizens. Like we used to say in Democracy 101, democracy is by the people, through the people, and for the people. So there is no democracy without the citizen, but it's rather alternatives that will improve governance system to deliver on the promises.
All right, thank you. Professor Boniface, we heard from Marie, but I'd want to ask you, is it possible to have a system or an alternative that would satisfy both the citizens and the leaders?
Look, as I said at the beginning, in Afrobarometer, we do ask our survey respondents, I think, if they would prefer alternatives to democracy, and we give them three options: military rule, one-man rule, namely dictatorship, or one-party rule. All of these are strongly rejected by African citizens on average, and the preference for democracy still remains very strong. So I don't think African citizens, and I want to reiterate, are not looking for an alternative to democracy, but they are looking for a governance systems that put the interests of citizens first. And their frustrations are not necessarily with democracy itself, but with the failure of democratically elected leaders to deliver. That's why I think we see strong support for elections as a form of selecting leaders. But the frustrations come in when people see that those that are elected are then forgetting the interests of the people who put them in those positions in the first place and advancing their own interests. So this, I think, is what is creating all these frustrations. But ultimately, the support and essence of democracy is still there. I think it's a good thing that we are also beginning to debate and question democracy. And I think that debate can only help to refine the means, the governance systems, can help, I think, to even put citizens themselves to realize that they themselves have a role to play in choosing leaders that can best represent them. Every election cycle from where I am, you keep on hearing people telling you that, if we wanted a better person to represent us, we would have chosen person X. But we chose person, why? Because they are from my political party, they are from my home district, or they are from my ethnic group and the like. But over time, I think when people started to question the caliber of these leaders that are being selected, not on the basis of their ability to deliver, but because of how close they are to them, I think over time, democracy, in my view, will get to improve. Remember, in the 1960s, when a lot of African countries became independent, most of them experimented with democracy for a short period of time. Then, we shifted to mostly, dictatorship, one-man rule, one-party rule, and that was there for more than 30 years. And then we began to realize that actually this is also not delivering, and then we've gone back to democracy. So it's part of an ongoing debate, and we should embrace the debate and these discussions on how can we make our democracies better. And I think that's what should be happening, and I think it's already happening in a couple of countries. We've seen changes in Senegal, where we've had alternations in Botswana, in Malawi, in Zambia, in Nigeria. In Ghana, it happens almost on a regular basis now, even in South Africa. people are now beginning to say, look, maybe democracy gives us the opportunity to try other leaders when those we have entrusted with power fail to deliver on our behalf. You see, as I think my colleague Marie, pointed out, the military can come in and make a lot of promises, but if they don't deliver on those promises, as it seems to be happening, the problem is people have no recourse. They cannot kick out a military government. You can't kick out a dictatorship. In a democracy, there is that possibility to get rid of underperforming leaders and bring in a new crop of leaders. Granted, I think the frustrations are that the changes that people want are not happening as quickly as maybe we would want, but democracy still gives us that hope, that opportunity that we might, bring in a leadership that delivers on people's citizens, and we can get rid of them if they don't live up to that, to our expectations.
Professor Stefano, you also did mention that an alternative may arise or will arise. Is it possible to have an alternative that will satisfy citizens and leaders at the same time?
Well, I don't know, but if this is the case, it means if you have an alternative that will satisfy both, it means that actually you have a model. You have something that can work not only in one country, but in many other countries. The success of alternative experience can push people in neighboring countries to experience this model as something viable. I think countries affect each other in their history. The French Revolution in Europe was one of the key for other countries in Europe to learn what to do in order to bring people at the center stage of politics. So obviously, if you develop a model like this is something that is not gonna, let's say, remain just limited to one country, but that can spread about. I wonder whether the alternative that we see can represent this kind of model. And I don't know. I agree with what colleagues said about hybrid regimes. This looks like an alternative. This is something that is taking force, that is, let's say, building in the long run as a serious alternative. I'm not saying that it's better than democracy. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that there are forces that push in that direction, not only in Africa. And I think there is another alternative, which is, I don't know how that can be, let's say, exported to other countries, but we should not forget that in the last 20 years, a country emerged as a leading economic power in the world and as a growing political force, which is China. And China is establishing relationship with many countries in the world, and they are not trying to export their model, but obviously their influence can push many people to explore alternatives and to consider, especially in the management of economic issues, to consider alternatives to what we had in the past. This is an alternative which is growing in prestige, and at least in China, it seems that it is really, let's say, providing a model that is satisfactory for both the people and the leadership. Because Chinese people are among those people that are more satisfied of their government. And this is something which is reported by many international scholars, by many international institutions, and something we can really trust. It's not just because people are afraid of speaking up in China that they say they are satisfied with the system. They are really satisfied with the system. And you can find that from many sources. So I think this is what you mentioned, and it's a case that we find in China, but not in many other countries. But China is growing in influence, and I think its influence in Africa is growing a lot. So I think many people can find inspiration from this model, at least on an ideological or rhetorical point of view, as a possible alternative to democracy.
Thank you. Mary, is it possible to build an African model of democracy while still preserving accountability, pluralism, and the rights of citizens?
Very good question. But I do think that I'm actually optimist, right? I'm optimistic about it that we can build an African model. Not to say that the current model is not working, right? Because there is this debate about foreign democracy being a foreign and imported concept, that it doesn't work in Africa. That's not what we are saying, but we are saying that we can have a democracy that fits the African model, the African realities. So it should mean adapting those democratic principles to our realities, our histories, and societies. And at its core, there should be participation, accountability, representation, and legitimacy. And I think this is what we see when you visit kingdoms and even communities in Africa. There is also democracy there, right? There is participation, accountability, representation, and legitimacy from the chiefs, from the kings to the people. So these are not foreign values, right? Many African societies have long traditions of that: community consultation, consensus building, collective decisions making. So the idea of an African model of democracy, for me, is not about inventing something entirely new, but it's just about reconnecting modern democratic system with local realities and practice. So performance-based. Yeah, that democracy should be, that African model of democracy must be performance-based, and it must be more inclusive. We know that, especially in Africa, where the young people, constituting the bulk of the population, then we need that stronger youth participation. We also need that greater involvement of women, and we need to recognize a local and traditional governance system. And I think it's on the question of recognition of local and traditional governance systems. I think it has started applying in some countries in Africa.
But do you think some of the things that you're mentioning would fit into the realities of the Sahel?
Oh, I think why not? Because as I said, we have to recognize each countries or each areas or each community specificity. The Sahel has its history. The Sahel has, a long-standing, ties with, France, and all those things should be taken into consideration. So I do believe that the Sahel, it can also apply. The only particularity with the Sahel is because the Sahel is a geostrategic, region, so it attracts a lot of foreign influences. And when those foreign influences are high, we tend to lose, those local realities. We tend to lose those specificities, because we want to follow the evolution of the world. We want to follow the global order. So I think it's even in the Sahel that it becomes a critical question. It becomes a critical need. The democracy should really be reflecting the African or the local reality. Otherwise, it might feel like we are seeing. Yeah, so the goal is not to abandon democracy, but to shape it into a system that truly reflects those societies and delivers trust, dignity, and effective governance. And the Sahel is not excluded.
All right. Professor Boniface, can alternative governance systems maintain legitimacy without elections and political pluralism, like in the case of the Sahel?
I'm always, I think, interested in this question of whether democracy is an African, so to speak, and that Africans are looking for something different. in Afrobarometer, every now and then we do ask a question on what does democracy really mean to people, to African citizens. If indeed democracy was really an alien and a different concept to Africa, then we would expect maybe less knowledge about it and maybe and understanding and attachments to democracy that are different from those that are obtained in the rest of the world. I am reminded of a paper that was done several years back that looked at how Africans really define democracy. And I think a plurality, about 1/3 of Africans actually looked at democracy and defined it in the context of civil liberties. And about a quarter were looking at a government that is responsive to the needs of the people and voting rights. Others attributing, I think, understanding of democracy to governments that deliver peace and unity, as well as those that deliver social and economic development. Now, I mention this because you see that that's actually how citizens, elsewhere in the globe look at the meaning and the attachments that they give to democracy. So I'm always hesitant to think that Africans are looking for something different from what obtains elsewhere in the world, at least based on these surveys that have been done across the entire continent. So I wanted to just highlight this, that what Africans really want are not any different from what citizens in other parts of the world want from democracy. And indeed, what the meaning that they give to democracy are quite similar to what other citizens the world over are also looking for. So Africans really want the same things from their government, just like other citizens, but also wanting governments that can deliver for them. So whether, we want to have a new system, I don't see that, I think, from the surveys that, the data that we have been collecting for the past, for more than 25 years now. We don't see any evidence that Africans are wanting a democracy that is any different from what other citizens the world over also want. Granted, we are latecomers, I think, as a continent to democracy, but it doesn't then mean that we attach, I think, we have different attachments or different meanings to democracy compared to the rest of the world.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Delany. We are about to wrap up this conversation, but before that, Marie, what should democracy advocates and civil society actors in West Africa or the Sahel prioritize moving forward?
Okay, the role of CSOs. I think CSOs play a critical role in that process, in that democratic process, and also in that democratic backsliding, erosion, and also that shift that we are seeing, especially also in a context like the Sahel, where trust in institutions is fragile. So I would say that their role is threefold. Bridging. We need a bridge between citizens and the states. In countries like the Sahel countries, where many citizens feel disconnected from political institutions, CSOs help to amplify citizens' voice and facilitate dialogue and ensure that local concerns, reach decision makers. So they make governance more participatory and inclusive. So what is happening now in the Sahel, where civil society, the civic space is shrinking, civil leaders are repressed, is really not the way to go if we have to consolidate or renew that democracy in the region. Then also, their role is also essential in defending those democratic principles and the civic space. Not only monitoring elections, but promoting transparency, advocating for human rights, holding governments accountable. Even in difficult contexts, they act as guardians of accountability. right? And I think the last one is on rebuilding trust and social cohesion, because given the current crisis of legitimacy in the Sahel, CSOs play a key role, right, in rebuilding trust between citizens and institutions, supporting peace-building efforts, and strengthening social cohesion at the community level. And I also spoke about reimagining governance. So beyond defending the system, CSOs are also important in rethinking how governance should work, right? As we see in many countries, they can propose reforms. We recently see in Ghana the reform, the constitutional reform process where CSOs were strongly engaged. So those are examples that we can take for CSOs. So it's an important challenge for CSOs, even though they also have their limitations, but strengthening civil society, it's essential in that whole process.
All right, thank you very much, Marie Jacinga. Professor Stefano, if you would have a recommendation for the Sahel, what would it be? Just under a minute.
Well, it's very difficult to focus on a region which has its own peculiarities, but actually the recommendation for the region, it's one that can follow general principles. So I think that what the region is looking for is first of all, more stability and security. I think that the let's say guarantee of physical integrity and basic rights of survival to the people is the main challenge, and it's one that will determine also what kind of political system will be built in the future.
Thank you very much, Professor Stefano. Professor Delani, looking ahead, what conditions are necessary for democratic systems in the Sahel to build public trust and legitimacy? Again, just under a minute as we are wrapping up the conversation.
I'm left wondering that if we didn't have the insurgency in the region, whether we would even be having these conversations about the future and fragility of democracy. Because we should remember that in Mali, and to some extent, even in Burkina Faso, we are among some of the strongest democracies that have existed on the continent, in historic terms. But I think it's the pressure that has brought on these countries because of the insurgency. I think it has impacted, I think, on politics in a significant way. So maybe, looking at how the international community can work together to help and address, I think, this problem of insurgency, I think could be the first step. Then, of course, building stronger institutions. When leaders feel that they are the only people who can lead their countries, that if they leave, then their countries will fall apart. I think that shows that the institutions are weak. Institutions should be stronger than individuals, because as individuals, we are all mortal. Institutions, strong institutions in particular, should outlive any individual, and that's what we should be building. I think stronger institutions.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Boniface. Today's discussion reminds us that the debate around democracy in the Sahel is no longer simply about elections. It's about legitimacy, governance, public trust, security, accountability, and the relationship between citizens and the state. Whether the region is experiencing democratic decline or political transformation remains contested, but what is undeniable is that the choices made today will shape the future of democracy and governance in West Africa in years to come. My sincere thanks to our guest, Professor Stefano from the University of Pavia in Italy, Boniface Delani of Afrobarometer and the University of Malawi, and Marie Jacinga of WADR. Thank you so much for joining us on Citizens Hour.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great pleasure to be with you.
All right, thank you. I am Veronique Njaya, and this is how we wrap it up for Citizens Hour, episode 3, supported by the National Endowment for Democracy in NED. Have a great day.